Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Hey, everybody. This is my continuation of my discussion with David Oliver of ABHR on the topic of municipal utility district financings. Now, and there's recently been some, at least I think it's very favorable legislation, Senate Bill 2038 that was recently passed. How has that impacted the provision of infrastructure as it relates to residential communities? Let's keep it at that, and the possible use of MUDs.
Yeah. So, I alluded earlier to cities having the ability to consent to a MUD on certain, on certain issues and impose conditions within certain parameters. And I think I probably gave you enough explanation there. Yeah. That applies. That right of a city to impose conditions is if you're creating a MUD within the city corporate limits or within the city ETJ, extraterritorial jurisdiction. And the ETJ it's effectively a sphere of influence that the state gave cities outside of their corporate limits, and it depends on your size. And it was generally a planning tool, right? So that cities could sort of control their destiny in the future. Not anything that's in the Constitution, not anything that's, has to happen. It was something that as growth was happening and people were trying to do it, the state wanted it to happen in an orderly way. They said, this makes sense to give them the right to have some input here and to facilitate long-term orderliness. Well, what happened is like most things, we had some situations, I think, where cities were taking that right and using it to, for blackmail and or to ask for things that are not appropriate, saying, we want you to give us this or to pay us that, or you're going to build this, and that things that are not consistent with state law. And so it puts a developer in a context of either having to walk away from a project, making it more expensive, or sue the city because, effectively those are exactions that are inapplicable. Can a city ask you to pay for certain things or a portion of certain things? Yes, but they are asking for you just outright pay for it and give it to them. And that's unfortunate because what it really was a byproduct of poor planning or poor financial planning on behalf of the cities. And they're like, well, we have this need. Well, you have tools too. You should have planned for it. And they saw an opportunity and they viewed it as taking it out of the developer's hide and not out of their constituents. Yep. But the problem is you're then passing that along ultimately to the MUD residents. And so just a lot of instances, I think some of the legislators were hearing from developers and even residents in some cases about cities sort of behaving badly in their and not really, because the cities would take the position and then you either have to walk away from a deal or you have to sue them. Well, that's not a great way to start a project, or you're going to go make a multi-tens of millions of dollar investment in land and you're in your first rattle out of the boxes, let's sue them. I mean, you're not going to do that. So the legislature last session passed Senate Bill 2038, which gave landowners the ability to opt out of their of a city's ETJ. You file a petition, and either the city can then act to remove you, or if not, by operation of law, you're excluded after 45 days. So that's where it is. And so, now listen, there are a couple of cities in North Texas that have filed suit and challenged the law. I would just tell you, not a legal opinion, not anything else, but I would just tell you that I think the reasoning's very shaky. It's something the legislature gave and they took it away, and they didn't take ETJs away, which, by the way, I think they could. They just gave a landowner the right to opt out, which is interesting because it was the extension of something that the legislature did 2 sessions before that, which was to modify the laws on city annexation because, again, of anecdotal concerns presented by developers, but also residents of cities annexing without consent of the residents and frankly, residents who said, I'm not in your city limits. You haven't done anything for me. Why do I want to come in and be subject to your tax and your bureaucracy? Yep. So that was the first step. then the next step was then they were behaving badly, not in annexing because they couldn't anymore, but they were just behaving badly in their ETJs. And I use that term, euphemistically. I'm just, kind of
Yeah,
playing.
yeah,
But and so in any event, there's pending legislation, and it'll be interesting to see how that it works out. But there's not an injunction, and so right now the law is the law, and what it has the potential to is, look, do I think somebody should just go and just opt out because they can? No, I think what the legislature intended was to reinsert balance into the negotiations between a landowner / developer and cities, so that you could, there was fair, equal footing or equal leverage. I mean, the playing field was tilted far to the city's advantage, and that was the reset. But what it does is it gives you optionality. It gives you the ability to go negotiate a fair deal with a city, number one, or number two, it also gives you the ability to say, you know what, if we can't do this, if we can't work out a deal, or a city has an unreasonable requirement and I don't want to litigate it, you can opt out, and then you don't have to get, you don't have to deal with the city. And now you still have to deal with the county. And I think that's the one thing that people need to understand. I mean, a lot of counties are viewed as easier and less restrictive to deal with than many cities. And that may be the case today. You have to think about, number one, their ability to review your plans and specifications and plats and everything else. But that's, many people, that's a risk many people are willing to take. And then you just need to monitor developments. I mean, I think it's just like cities and counties do already. They're constantly updating their rules based on what they're encountering. So, for anyone to think you need to talk carefully about, understand your facts and circumstances, you need to understand the politics, and you need to constantly monitor the situation. But it is an advance, like I said. I think it's one that is something that could certainly lower the barrier to entry, make it easier to get deals done, in theory, because it's introduced some balance into the negotiating process. And in some ways, it can free your projects potentially of bureaucracy, unneeded bureaucracy and red tape, which is something you alluded to earlier, which again can then help. All of those things can help affordability, right?
And I think it's in everybody's best interest. And I say this, the public and private sectors working collaboratively together, to put together great projects. And clearly there was an imbalance, as you had indicated there. And at least what we're seeing, 2038 has had an impact in bringing some of the cities to the table and being more reasonable in their discussions and their requests.
And I would tell you, we've seen that. I mean, certainly, I think there are some deals that have gotten done, and people would tell you they would not have gotten done without the specter of 2038 sitting out there.
For those of our listeners that have not heard about new financing mechanisms that have come forth in Texas, one of the issues that David had alluded to and that I had talked about is the fact that when we're using MUD financings, we have to put the infrastructure in the ground, we have to sell the houses, or we have to sell the pods to the builders. The builders have to put up their homes, get certificates of occupancy, get them on the tax rolls, and then we're able, through the ad valorem and the general obligation bonding process, to issue debt to repay the developers. And so the good thing is that there was a lot of certainty, and the MUD industry, thanks to ABHR, David, and the other attorneys in the TCQ, are very efficient and effective in issuing bans and bonds. And literally the MUD financings run like a Swiss railroad, and in my opinion. But the challenge has always been, how do we accelerate cash into the pro forma? Prior to this, the only thing that, at least in my experience, that the developers could do is sell their reimbursements to a private investor that would typically buy that anywhere from a 12 to a 15% discount rate. And anyway, with David's help, and David, I'd like to say this publicly, thank you for all of the help that you gave in helping the industry solve a problem, and allowing us to work with an out-of-state bond attorney who was willing to learn how MUDs work, how they contract, how funds are flow through from the developer to the MUD, who owns the rights of way, who owns the easements, who owns the infrastructure, how it's turned over, how it's maintained, all of those detailed questions to allow a legal professional to provide a tax exempt bond opinion for what we call right now the forward funding of MUD reimbursements, which occur anywhere in real world from 5.5% to 7.5% today. And we didn't know what to call that. So for our program, we're just calling it the launch bond. So David, I'm going to refer to the launch bond. But first of all, I would like to say thank you for doing that and being the first guinea pig, if I can use that, as MUD General Counsel on the Randolph, Texas Lariat transaction, which was $35.5 million up in Williamson County, to really allow us to prove this concept to the market. Now it's really taken off. But as it relates to this forward funding and what I'm going to be referring to as launch bonds, how do you see this transforming the industry possibly as it relates to the use of MUDs and the ability of developers to recycle their investments much quicker in a MUD project?
Well, it's I think it's just an extension of what we talked about before, and then also some things that are happening in the market. At the end of the day, we talked about just like with MUDs historically, right? What we've always, I said, be quick but don't hurry.
Yep.
And the point there was always to get projects on the ground as quickly as possible, but in a quality way, and then to complete financings as quickly as possible. And the reason for that is we all know whether it's investment capital, whether it's borrowed money, or whether it's our own capital. In the context of a developer, it is there's a cost of funds. And so the longer things take to develop, the longer things take for financings to occur, that drives up the cost. And so, that's always been, a point of emphasis is the more efficiently we can do things. Again, if the developer's performing, you want to reward them, and by returning the dollars that they loaned to you, which is what's happening.
Yep.
And of course, the longer you leave it out, that puts stress on them because they're paying interest on either equity, debt, or that's missed opportunity cost for capital that they're using.
Yeah.
And so what happened is, I think a couple things. First, the cost of funds has gone up with some of the things that have happened in the market, right? With lending, particularly with a lot of the banks, whether they're big banks who are unwilling to loan to small fish. A lot of the middle market banks have been squeezed lately. We won't get into that, but everybody's aware of that. And many of them aren't doing anything, loaning money on or making development loans anymore, or at least for the time being, or there's scarcity of capital. Now, the flip side of it is, I think there's other folks who have looked at the development side, said, well, wait a minute, this is really infrastructure.
Yeah.
And said that they've indicated a willingness to invest, and I'll use it that way in it. And so I think what you've seen is just the sort of market at work. One, people understanding this as infrastructure. Two, understanding the point that I made earlier, the predictability and certainty and really rules around how MUD financing works, and said, well, wait a minute, we can underwrite that and sort of, correlate that backwards a little bit. And, the one thing that's important to note is that in MUD financings, the way the rules work is the MUD pays the developer back, and they pay them back at the borrowing rate of the district at the time the district sells the bonds. Well, that's generally a tax exempt municipal rate, which is typically lower than what the cost of capital is in the private markets. And so there's a gap, right, in between what the MUD borrowing rate is and what the developer is able to borrow at. And so again, that's another expense. The longer it goes out, that's just money out of the developer's pocket that they can't recoup. And so what I think has really happened is you've now seen folks in in the transactions you described, be able to work backwards, get to a place where there is somebody who is willing to, for a premium, a difference between the mud bond for the risk they are taking. And the risk is really kind of home building, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got lots on the ground. You've got streets in, you've got utilities. You're really waiting for the builders to perform and for there to be a market proved up and or fed, create that value, then the mud can sell the bonds. Well, a lot of sophisticated investors and or underwriters can do enough due diligence and get pretty comfortable, and you can speak to it more than I can, but they get pretty comfortable with, okay, how long do I expect to wait based on market conditions and this developer, the builders that they have, the project, are we just coming out of the ground or are we doing this midstream, and come up with a discount rate, to effectively buy the receivables, the mud receivables, at a price that makes sense to the investor from an investment standpoint on return on investment, and that is palatable to the developer, right? I mean, for the longest time, this market's been around forever.
Yeah.
There have been guys that are hard money lenders or others who have been willing to do it, but we didn't see a lot of it. We saw some of it, and we saw inquiries, but you didn't see a ton of it because the price of the price was too expensive for a developer. A developer said, "I'm not taking a 25% haircut or a 15% haircut even." Because I know I have confidence in my project. I know when it's coming, and dollars are dollars.
Yep.
And so number one, that was a problem. I think number two is right now we're in a market where there's a lot of opportunity. And so if you can get the discount to a reasonable number, number one, it gives the developer certainty on exit. They can pay their debt off, pay their equity off, whatever it is. But then they can go because capital is scarce. They can go take that capital that they get out of the sale transaction and reinvest it in a new project. And for them, there is more profit in that than there is in sitting around waiting to collect, that discount. So that's where that arbitrage between, my opportunity to go take money and replenish it and redeploy it and generate a return versus what's the cost of me getting that money. And it's no different than what you do pro formaing a new deal. When you're just looking at your development loan and saying, am I going to make money on it or not? It's the same
exactly.
It's a very objective transaction.
Boy, you hit the nail. Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. And the other thing, just to kind of bring it back, the reason this structure is working so well is because a lot of the rules and regulations and oversight that has been put into place as a result of the 80s and 90s. Everybody understands it. It's very, it's regulated. A lot of the bond buyers understand how the MUDs work, and they're looking at this as another way to, they know how the MUDs are issuing debt. And if they can make an extra 150 basis points, by investing earlier in the transaction, if you will, than when they would typically do that, it's beneficial to them as well. And the other thing that you touched on is we say, hey, don't believe Froelich or don't believe the developer in terms of when houses are going to get on the ground. Obviously, we're discussing what the master plan developer has sold to builders, what are currently under construction, and then we'll go get a third party, burn study saying what does the price and pace look like. And then we'll go to the MUD engineer and can you certify what the costs are that are unreimbursed to date? Here again, you don't have to opine to it, but just let us know that these are the types of facilities that the TCQ, assuming water, sewer, storm drain, parks, typically approve. And then, once we have that burn study or the Zonda study or third-party market study, we give it to the FAs of the MUDs and have them show their projections. So these are, all third-party experts that are putting forth their opinions to help package the sale of these reimbursements. So as we're starting, and David, I appreciate all the time you've given me so far today, and I'm going to start to move to the conclusion. But as you're sitting here today and somebody came to you and said, hey, David, we're looking at doing a MUD, what would be the things that you would want them to walk away from that meeting with you as it relates to items that they should be considering as it relates to the use of a MUD or similar type financing mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of it goes back to the conversation we had earlier about comparing vehicles, and it's what's your project, what are you trying to accomplish, and so that you can actually understand and make sure that I have some conversations with folks sometimes, and they're like, hey, I need to get this, and I can't. Mud doesn't do that, or doesn't pay for that, can't pay for that, or we only pay for it in this way, or they're looking for funding up front. And so it's really a matter of knowing what you need, knowing your project, knowing what you need, and then looking at the tools that are available. And so in the context of a mud, you come say, hey, I need a mud, and I have some people say that, and they don't need a mud, or they can't. It won't make sense. And for some of the reasons I talked about, whether it's just land size, whether it's cost. They're just not generating enough value, whether or not it's the cost of the project. I mean, sometimes and I find myself doing that a lot. We start penciling, working with them, and I'm like, your project doesn't work, right? We have those conversations, and somebody thinks that the mud is well, this is what it costs, and they'll say, oh, I'll just get the mud, I'll get reimbursed by the mud, and the answer is no. There are limitations on what a mud. Number one, the types of things a mud can finance, and number two, when, how, and to what extent they can finance it. And so a lot of it is don't be presumptuous, and make sure you understand there's cost, right? I mean, there's cost with anything in terms of upfront, and the upfront capital and development. There are upfront costs with the mud because you're starting, and we discussed earlier, you're basically starting a new governmental structure, and so there's some upfront costs. Now, all of that's eligible to get repaid. And then the next step is once you understand your project and your project needs, you then understand, does it pencil? And it's important, I think, to work with a mud attorney, to work with an engineer who understands the mud rules and is capable of giving you good cost estimates and understanding the timing, because they're good at that. And then also there are municipal advisors that are involved in the financing transactions who can help you model it. And some people have done lots of this stuff and they're very good at it, but lots don't understand how the financing works. And so you want to certainly do that. And so that's my only point. It's like anything else. Start talking to those folks as early as possible, and make sure you keep them involved, because one of the things we do is somebody comes to me like 30 days before, and they're like, before their due diligence period or inspection period expires, and they I tell them a bunch of things that they didn't know they needed to do, like we're gonna have to go talk to the city, or the city may want to provide utilities, or county drainage plan, you name it. I can go through those, and they're like, okay, well, I got to have that. And it's like, we're not getting that done in 30 days.
Exactly.
So I think we're most successful, and even on challenging tracks, is when clients come to us even before they put it under contract. I know that sounds crazy, but as I always say, hey, I'm not going to charge you for that. I want to get you, because where I've had success on some challenging things has been to say, you need to talk to the landowner and understand that city, that tract, whatever, has challenges, or they describe what they need to do. And I'm like, that's going to take 6 months, 9 months. And I was going to get a 90-day feezy. You're not going to have that resolved. So let's save all of ourselves a bunch of time and energy and money, and don't do it, because you can't get that done. And that's where talking to the engineer, particularly the attorney, can be helpful in sort of even just structuring your purchase and sale agreement, right? So that you've got enough time in there to get your stuff done, and get it done so you're not putting your capital at risk. Because there's nothing worse than for a buyer than creeping up to their inspection or feasibility period, and then not having all the things they need. And so you're basically taking a gamble with either walking away from a deal that otherwise could have made, or you're basically putting, there are no certainty. So you're putting money at risk. You're gambling with, whatever your earnest money deposit is that goes hard, while you continue to try to close the deal. And we see that regularly working on getting extensions. And then I spend time talking to sellers and explaining to them, let me tell you why. And, because they don't understand. So it's interesting. It's interesting. And that's what I'm saying is, my best advice is know your deal, know your costs, know what you're expecting from the mud, and talk to people who know so they can help you. I mean, look, I always say, if you don't have a deal, I don't have a deal. So I am incentivized to make, because if you don't have a project that starts, we're not going to create a mud and then have something to represent on my side. So in any event,
and start early with the mud. I mean, it's your financing. If your financing is critical, which it is, I don't know any projects where it's not. You've got to look at these tools, and you have to start sooner rather than later, because you're not going to get them done at the end of the transaction due diligence. So,
yeah, that's exactly right.
One thing I've been meaning to ask you for a lot of years, David, I haven't, but what has been your greatest learning experience? If you had a do-over, or, try to boil it down to one. I know we've all had a lot of learning experiences, but is there one that's top of mind that kind of pops up when I ask that question?
Wow. So many, and I don't know if there's one that pops top of mind, but I mean, I do think it really plays back into the question you just asked right before that, and it's this is, I've had situations, where and what I learned sort of early on is communication, and that's why I was saying get people involved. There's so many layers to a development project, and to developing infrastructure and financing it. And so the one lesson I've always I've learned is try to communicate early and often, and ask the hard questions. Because it's not it's so that I can do what I need to do, because a lot of times you don't ask, or you assume something, and everybody's deal is different. Everybody's capital source, their expectations, just all those things, their level of experience. And so for me, it's really been, in these transactions, in these deals, it's trying to talk as early as possible, as often as possible, and putting a bunch of stuff, out on the table. And it's because most things are solvable. Like we can get most things done if we just know about them and we have the time to deal with them.
Yep.
And here's the thing, to that end, I was going to say, and I know you said only one, but then you can't fall in love with the deal, because sometimes it's, you say that, I mean, at some point, if you can't solve it, you just can't solve it. And it's maybe just not that time for the deal, whether it's the landowner, maybe the seller is just, thinks too highly of their land and they don't understand the challenges. That happens. Or maybe it's just not the right time, in depending on who you're dealing with, they can't underwrite it. And so that's my kind of all tied together, is just that you got to communicate a lot. On development's complicated, infrastructure is complicated. Lots of tools available that we've talked about today and otherwise. But we need to all make sure we're talking same set of assumptions, same facts, same understandings, same goals. And that we're also understand, and we're communicating that before, because if you don't communicate early and often, and you're not communicating when money starts to get real, oops. And then somebody, and that's when things go sideways, is because it's landing in someone's lap.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I mean, you can never communicate enough, and I think also very succinctly, and like to your point, you have to have sometimes difficult conversations, because only with those conversations do you get the real information you need to move forward, or kill it, or stall it. I mean, put it on ice for a while.
I can't solve problems or tell you about unsolvable problems that I'm unaware of.
Yeah, exactly. Great. And to that point, for our listeners, David's contact information will be included in the show notes. And I really do encourage you to reach out to David on any of the issues or topics that you've heard here today, or you're looking to do a public financing. Pick up the phone. And he'll be responsive, and I can guarantee that. And David, I just want to say thanks again. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Obviously, our relationship goes way back, and you're a good friend, and I really appreciate everything you've done and continue to do for the industry and Texas and developers as a whole. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for the kind words, Carter, and I'm just glad to do it, and enjoy working with you, and we'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
And that concludes my final part of my conversation with David Oliver from ABHR on the topic of municipal utility district financings.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Follow us wherever you find your podcast to never miss a new episode.